Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Geoffrey, and I'm a Methodist minister based in Putney in London. Before I was ordained, I spent 10 years working in the House of Commons as a clerk, and I'm committed to connecting how we pray and read our scriptures with how we vote and how we live. Each week, I'm joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. And today I'm very pleased to be joining Sienna Sexton in Oxford. Sienna is a recent graduate of politics and international relations, and during university she was involved in establishing The Switch ethical banking campaign. She now works for Just Love UK, working to equip students and support graduates to pursue justice with their whole lives. Sienna works with students in Oxford and Nottingham and with alumni. She's passionate about equipping people to reach their potential and working for impactful social justice. In her free time, Sienna can be found trying to learn French, running, reading, rock climbing, and volunteering to support refugees. Well, Sienna, it's lovely to have you with us, and thank you so much for giving up your time to be with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a real great fun to be with you today.
Oh, good. Now, Sienna, we always ask the same question of everybody. The first question is always the same. When you hear people saying that politics and the pulpit shouldn't mix, what's your response?
Well, I actually have a bit of a mixed response. I think on the one hand, I'm really convinced that our faith has social consequences, as we've seen from its start with Jesus really living alongside people on the margins and challenging religious figures. And then also in the early church, you see this again in the way that the social norms are just kind of flipped on its head with who's included in community and the way that community is done, and the consequences that had for the way that they were living. It was a real threat to or seen as a real threat to the Roman state. And so you see that the Christian faith has always kind of been somewhat political because of its social consequences. And also as a student of politics, I'd be betraying myself if I didn't say that I think politics is integrated into so much of life and into so many of the decisions that we make that we really can't take faith out of the picture. Just as when we go to church, we don't leave ourselves at the door, we take our whole selves, including our political and opinions and our social opinions and the issues that we're facing, into church. And so also if you're in a place where you're teaching, into the pulpit. However, on the other hand, I think when I hear this, I sometimes what comes to mind is the US and the rise of the religious right, and how that's kind of led quite negatively to increased politicization and divisiveness, and that sits quite uncomfortably with me. So I'd probably say that party politics, so politics of the big P, shouldn't be preached from the pulpit, in my opinion, and that we should always probably as Christians be uncomfortable with what some of each of the parties say. We're never going to probably align perfectly with all of them. However, our faiths and thus our pulpits will always be calling us into the world and into the social issues that are around us. And so we will be forced to engage with the political and social structures around us. And so I think that, while I don't think that party politics should be in the pulpits, I do think that politics will inevitably and has always been part of the Christian faith, engaging with it has been.
That prophetic voice, perhaps, where you need to be a critical friend. Yes. That sounds yes, I'd agree with everything there. So thank you for that, Sienna. Before we plunge into our readings, we just note what's going on in the world within the life of the church. We are in Lent. Yesterday was Refreshment Sunday, so I hope people felt refreshed after that. We're about halfway through, and we're coming up to Passion Sunday this Sunday. We're marking 2 UN days in the coming weeks: the UN International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination on the 21st of March, and the UN International Day of Remembrance for the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade on the 25th. And we've got World Water Day on the 22nd of March. And all of these might be relevant for what we're going to discuss later. In the news, we have President Xi of China visiting Putin in Moscow. We've got Boris Johnson's Partygate defence to be published today, and a grilling by the Commons Privilege Committee on Wednesday, which I have a horrible feeling will take things to a new low, but there we go. Although we struggle to understand it, there was a forced takeover of Credit Suisse over the weekend. I say some of us will struggle to understand it because the world of banking and finance does seem to be a very complicated one. And all of those issues, or perhaps none of them, will come up later in our discussions. In terms of the lectionary, once again, we have a nice meaty reading from John to follow the others we've had this Lent. This time it's the raising of Lazarus from John 11. We have from Romans 8, Psalm 130, and one of the best known and perhaps best loved passages in the Old Testament, Ezekiel chapter 37, the Valley of Dry Bones. So, Sienna, those readings, sometimes it's hard to easy, as we've been doing it since Christmas, sometimes we struggle to see the connection. Are there any themes that emerge for you from those 4 readings?
Yeah, I actually felt that there were quite a few themes that tied them together, and was quite excited by the fact that there were some really interesting things that we could pull out this week. So across the text, I feel like some of the key themes that we could draw are around how do you engage with hopelessness, like hope and hopelessness, or hope in the midst of hopelessness. And then there's also things around redemption and what does it look like for there to be like restoration of life, also in the midst of grief, suffering, and death.
Yeah, that sounds all good. Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
So some nice small issues to wrestle with. Where would you like to start as we begin to bring those themes out?
Yeah, well, maybe we could start in the Valley of Death, and it's only going up from there, I suppose.
Yeah. So we're in the Valley of Dry Bones with Ezekiel in chapter 37.
Yeah. So this passage, I think, for so many of us it's an incredibly evocative and maybe slightly confusing passage. I think for me, it's always been one that I've been like, wow, the imagery in this is so strong. As someone who loves literature and reading and who has a lot of poet friends, it's something that really, the imagery that's here is really striking. And I think that we are drawn into this passage in many ways. But I think the reason that this passage maybe resonates so much is because I think all of us in some ways have seen in the world around us. I think for me particularly, this is relevant when I look at the world and try and see what God's doing. Is so often it feels like actually we're in this like dark place where there's no hope, and actually what we're seeing around us, particularly when we read the news, is death and destruction and just absolute hopelessness, including when you look at our national politics as much as when you look at things going on around the world. And this passage is really striking in that God invites Ezekiel into the midst of this Valley of Dry Bones, which is a slightly horrifying image. I think in some ways, like maybe slightly, when I was a bit younger, it was like slightly frightening to think that you're there in the midst of all of this death. And he then invites Ezekiel to be part of the process of restoration. We see this amazing story unfold where God through Ezekiel brings this valley to life and brings these people to life, and we just see this incredible picture of this. I love the fact that he uses, it's not just bones, but it's like dry bones. There's no life. There's nothing there. There's nothing that is living still, and God uses even in the midst of this dryness, he brings out life and completely brings back newness of life. And I think that's just so powerful and striking when we look around the world and we see more wars. We see also like huge amounts of drought and like climate instability, and like we're not even really talking about it, but there as much as we should be potentially, like the droughts that are happening in the Horn of Africa and in Eastern Africa. And then also on the other hand, you have the fact that there's been massive devastation in Malawi and other countries with Cyclone Freddy, and how that's just been an unprecedented and totally destructive cyclone. And like when you're looking at those kinds of, when we're thinking about climate, actually, how do we think of, can we use this passage to give us hope when it just seems really hopeless? I don't know if you've seen, but today the IPCC, I think, or is it
IPCC,
IPCC,
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I think, but
thanks. Well, their newest report is coming out today, and the headlines aren't looking good. And essentially, if we're going to keep below 1.5 degrees, we're going to require some really drastic action in the next couple of years, in the very, very near future. And it doesn't feel like we're anywhere near getting to that stage politically within the UK, but also around the world. Like there's a lot of confusion over how some of the biggest polluters in the world, like their policies just often contradict each other. So there'll be some really amazing action on climate change, and then there's also new investments in fossil fuels. And so it just feels like at the moment we really need a bit of that life being breathed into the world. And that I think that I definitely find, as someone who's been involved in climate action and climate activism, sometimes there can be like, either there's like an overemphasis on the grief, and there's like a complete lack of hope, but then on the other hand there can be like a no, we can do this, like the world, it will be totally fine. And there's, I think, Christianity and passages like this bring this like real hope into the picture, which is really helpful, just even practically when engaging with with activism, because you have an acknowledgement of the fact that there's the valley of dry bones, but then also that we do have this hope that through us, but like God as sovereign can act and can breathe new life into situations of extreme hopelessness. And I find that like really encouraging, but also I feel like this passage, and maybe we can hop into some of the other passages as well, it allows us to dwell in the valley of dry bones as well, and acknowledge that as a reality, which is also important when engaging with the injustices around us.
And I think that's, it raises so many interesting things that a preacher could pursue. I think there's two I'd pick out. First of all, there is the challenge, a perennial challenge for preachers of, and we've talked about this again in the last few months, there's that traditional purpose of the preacher is to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And as a preacher, I'm very conscious of that need to balance. You've got to challenge people out of their complacency on all sorts of issues, but you also have to offer comfort and hope. And as you said, there is that real balance, which I know pressure groups and charities face it as well, because they recognize that if it's unrelenting bad news, which it could be, then people will just switch off and disengage. And I think that is very true of the climate crisis, because we have had to really push people's faces into it and say, it is as bad as you think. But if we focus on the water issue from the valley, I think there is so much there. And we both, I think, had read the same article in The Guardian from last week. And it's something we've known about for a long time. The security of water supply is going to be the next big crisis. And
it's already a crisis in so many places.
Yes.
I don't know. So I try and keep abreast of global news and a bit of like development news. I'm very proactive in where I get my news sources from, because I think sometimes it can just feel like a horrific onslaught of terrible news. And so I also try to focus on getting my news from places that are action oriented, or like there's some hope in there, because you can hear about the things that people are actually doing. So I get like a range of kind of newsletters from all sorts of different organizations and news sources, and this has really opened my eyes to some issues that we're not really talking about. And I think we all know that climate change is having huge impacts on people, like through natural disasters. But I think kind of like my passion for climate action was sort of reignited when I was hearing from some stories from Somalia about how there's been a massive, well, like a bit of an increase in intertribal violence, but this isn't because of anything other than just a lack of water in the regions, and the government's really struggling to try and like temper the violence, because ultimately it's just about a lack of resources. And if we're already seeing this now and we're not even at 1.5 degrees warming, it's only going to get worse. And so both like water poverty, in that like we really want everyone to have access to clean water is really important, but just like access to water full stop is already a challenge, and is only going to get worse if we don't drastically change things.
Yes. And in a Christian context, of course, we're very conscious of the water of life and the symbolism of water, and Jesus coming from a country where water management is very important, always historically has been, and is now very controversial about who gets access to water in Israel and Palestine. But also, as you say, we're going to see, and we already have seen, conflict between nations about water, and there's again a Christian input there, and in the idea that this is an issue that transcends national boundaries, and it's another nail in the coffin of nationalism. It just shows why nationalism doesn't work, because water does not respect national boundaries, and we're seeing conflicts as you say, in East Africa in particular at the minute, because rivers flow from, they don't just stick in one country, they flow through countries, and countries share those resources, and we're going to have to work above and beyond national boundaries to transcend these issues.
No, you're right, we really are. And it's a real challenge, because I think it requires this kind of imagination, which is part of the whole, like, I don't know, there's a part of like the challenge of the prophets as well, is like this, bringing this like new imagination to the way that we respond to issues that feel really intractable. And that's like I think that it's a real challenge to the church, and also to politicians, to be trying to bring the imagination, like the imagery of the breathing of new life into the valley of dry bones. And how do we do that? I don't know if we could like go back a little bit in our conversation, if that would be okay. I feel like we talked a little bit about, we touched briefly on what it looks like to kind of like dwell in the valley, and that like really links into some of the other passages.
Perfect. Let's go on. Yeah. Where would you like to go next?
Maybe we could start with Psalm 130.
Perfect. Yeah. So Psalm 130. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. So as you say, we're back in the valley of despair. What would you like to say here, Sienna?
I think I just want to unpack what it means to engage with lament. I think that as Christians, we can so often move straight into praise and straight into the reimagination. But I think that this passage, if we look at it, it ends with like, I wait for the Lord more than the watchmen wait for the morning. And then Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for the Lord is unfailing. Well, for with the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. He himself will redeem Israel for all their sins. I think that like, actually this psalm, it doesn't really reach a resolution. Like, it's calling people to rely on the Lord, but it's not saying like, and God responded to our cries. Actually, this is one of those psalms that like ends with the, yes, you live in hope and you put your trust in God and Jesus, but actually people, you're still in that position where you are waiting. And I think that maybe in my experience living in the UK over the past however many years, I've definitely seen that like the UK church is, maybe it's also particularly the denominations that I've been in, but we don't necessarily sit comfortably in lament. And like I've never really been in a space outside of some of the Just Love spaces that I was in as a student, and see now actually with some of the students that I work with, like a space for corporate lament, and like crying out together to the Lord. And I think that that's something that we don't find easy. Maybe it's just as like slightly emotionally repressed British people, but also, yeah, we don't have that kind of cultural understanding of how to do grief together. But I do think that there's so much that we can learn, and the Bible has, like, Lamentations is a whole book of the Bible about lament. So many of the Psalms are sat in this place of lament. And I think that like actually the process of going through lament in order to get to hope, or in order to get to action, is like really crucial when you engage with justice. Because if you haven't read anything by Emmanuel Katangole, I would really recommend it. There's this book that he wrote called Born from Lament, and then also Walter Brueggemann is excellent on these. But both of these authors have really shaped the way that I, as someone who's really passionate about justice, has really like helped me to engage with God and suffering, and how do I sit in this place with like a good God in the midst of like intense suffering, sometimes in my own life, but often in the world around me and in the lives of people that I know, particularly refugees. And I think that like the pattern of lament as like acknowledging that things aren't right and like waiting in that time, and then calling God to action is like so powerful. We don't just like sit there crying, but actually, for example, in this psalm, it's like, out of my depths I cry to you, let your ears be attentive for my cry, to my cry for mercy. And then like, put your hope in the Lord, with the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. We see that like actually God listens, and just as God listens, we can see in the passage in John that actually like God takes part in that process of lament, and that's an incredibly powerful thing. And also, it's really, I'm really compelled by what Walter Brueggemann writes around how like actually if we aren't lamenting well, we can be involved in like unhistorical or completely like socially removed praise. Like, we're not actually praising God from the midst of our circumstances, like when the world is like falling down around you, or it feels like it in your personal circumstances, when you're going through personal like crises, or those around you are like, actually I think praise is a really powerful thing, but also like acknowledging the suffering and being able to praise from that position of having lamented is really helpful, and is also biblical. And I think it's something that I used to be scared of, but it's something that I've seen really helpful for people, like particularly some of the asylum seekers and refugees that I've worked with, who are in these positions of, like, not all of them are people of faith or Christians, but they're all in this position of waiting. They're at the mercy of a fairly broken system, even according to Home Office like publications. Like, the system isn't working that well in the UK. So, and we're about to start offshoring people to Rwanda, even victims of modern slavery, which is just very depressing. We're really praying that the courts find it to be illegal. But when I think, yeah, I've had there's been some really powerful stories recently in Oxford of some of the refugees coming along to churches and just like coming up to church, like, and really like crying and bringing to the church the fact that their families are still in really dangerous countries, and that they aren't there, and that they can't help, and that the families are being threatened by the authorities. And what do you, as a Christian, like, we sit so comfortably in the church, actually like being able to live alongside in some way these refugees, it really takes me out of myself, because like, that's just so different to my reality. And what does it look like for them? And the fact that they can come to church and they can come and ask for prayer and be supported by their community in some small way is incredibly powerful, but also like so challenging. How do you trust God in those positions? And to see them being able to do that is, I don't know if I would have that strength, actually, if I'm totally honest.
I mean, I'd agree with everything you said there about the power of lament and the situation. And I think there is that the experiences of hopelessness. Now, of course, as you say, there's nothing really that most of us can, for most of us, it would be a situation of grief or illness or loss. But for folks like the ones you volunteer with, asylum seekers, refugees, that is their daily reality of a broken system. And it is a valley of dry bones with no seeming hope. And the church, I feel as a minister, we feel so helpless a lot of the time, because we can offer a little bit here or a little bit there, but we cannot change that, especially if the illegal immigration bill comes into force. We will be utterly powerless. Now, what I think we may have to skip Romans. So to preachers out there, we're sorry, but we've got most preachers will be wrestling with the gospel at some point. And if you've got the gospel reading Ezekiel, then I think there's a lot there. Yeah, because it's another large chunk from John. So coming into John's gospel and the death of Lazarus, interesting to pick up what you say there about needing time for lament. Now, there's a theological purpose there, but Jesus does allow time for lament with the death of Lazarus. He doesn't go off immediately and make everything right. And as he says there, he says, and he's criticized by that, by Martha, if you had been here. But he said, these things are happening to show the Messiah. But there is time for lament, and there is genuine lament. And of course, we have the famous Jesus wept verse. So we've got real lament going on there. What else would you like to sort of pick up about this passage?
Yeah, I think it's just really striking how God through Jesus as God, enters into the people suffering around him, and does that in a way that you see in the ways that he responds to Mary and Martha. He responds individually, and he responds differently based on what they need. And I think that's really beautiful, actually, to see that our God's a God who cares enough and knows enough about each of us to be able to, in that he knew them in a different way to the way that he knows me. I don't know God as flesh in front of me right now, but it's really beautiful to see how Jesus responded to each of those women and responded to their grief, and wasn't I think there's also so we can take lament as this thing that's very maybe God can deal with it, maybe God can't. Is it okay for me to really be well, God, what are you doing here, and ask those kinds of big questions, and in that passage they're literally asked to Jesus's face, if you had been here earlier he wouldn't have died. And that's really challenging to me, because I think I often can hold back because it feels oh no, I can't say this, this is a step too far, but actually that God really doesn't mind, and in that relationship responded to that. And then I think so that's a lot about God entering into the process of lament, but also it's just crazy to think that God enters into the same grief about suffering, even when he knew that he was going to go and bring Lazarus literally back from the grave. Jesus wasn't just hang on 5 minutes, pause your grief, I'm going to go and sort this out and then we can have another chat. Jesus chose to be present with them in that moment and to rage against death. When it says that Jesus cries out, I'm sure that this won't be new news for people, but by that crying out, it's a violent shout, a violent cry of anger at the fact that Lazarus is dead. And I think it's sometimes it doesn't feel And I know that God cares about injustice, but to think that like God is actually really angry at injustice and at death, there's something quite comforting about that, particularly if you're in the midst of grief. And then you move from this place of like God being in grief, and like really being present there, God being angry at death and injustice, to God bringing about complete transformation and restoration and redemption in a way that was like beyond the imagination of anyone there. I don't think anyone thought that Jesus was gonna do that. We don't see that in the passage. Well, we do. No, sorry, I lie. We don't see that from everyone in the passage, and the disciples were really confused. We do see when Jesus talks about being the redemption and life, and I can't remember if it's Mary or Martha who's like, I know that anything's possible through you. But we see that like Jesus does seemingly the impossible. And when we were talking earlier about hope in the midst of hopelessness, this is one of the most striking examples of that. And then we see this again in the cross, when you see utter hopelessness, and then actually it's brought about like greater hope and greater like great good for all people. I
mean, this wonderful story, and you can see very clearly why the people who put the lectionary together brought these two stories together. Out of despair, hope; out of the valley of death comes life. And a wonderful, powerful message there, one of the most important Christian messages. But again, it's that the question that you've raised is, how long do we stay in lament? Because that is the challenge for us. How long do we stay by the graveside before we say there's hope? And one of the things I've seen in my own ministry with facing people, being with people who've lost somebody, people who are grieving, the most important thing is to allow time for lament. It's to allow people to be sad. And I think if we're taking this from a political angle, perhaps to allow people to be sad and angry about the way of the world. But we're back to that question: how long, oh Lord, do we let people say? And is it? And this is something that the church has faced with the climate crisis, several others, and of course there are talking about unhelpful responses from the USA. There are unhelpful responses from some Christians, not a minority, I would stress, who see the climate crisis as God's punishment on the earth, and it's all about the destruction of the planet will come, and that will usher in the second coming. Not really helpful. There are those who say, oh, well, it's sad now, but God's going to sort it all out. And there are Christians who are saying, we're all going to go to hell in a handcart, we're all doomed. So where do you think we should sit? What's a Christian response to this situation? Focusing perhaps for the moment on the climate crisis.
Well, I think that as Christians, we're called to sit in the reality, but we're called to bring us about of a new reality, and also to trust in ultimate hope. Like, I think that as Christians, we should hope for and works really hard for change in the here and now. Like, we want to be committed to action, and we want to be committed to calling out our governments to action, potentially going along to protests. Just like we're going along to the XR protest, the big one, which is a coalition building protest against climate change. It's not going to be
when's that?
From the 21st to the 24th of April. And we're going to be going along with Christian Climate Action. And I think part of the reason that we're going is because it can feel really hopeless, but we need to be committed to going out and acting as being part of bringing the kingdom, which is what we're called into. But we also I think there's a level to which we can acknowledge that potentially not everything will go how we hope it will, but that doesn't mean that we're not called to be committed to living in that in between. There's this book that I love called The World's Not Ours to Save, and it's by this guy called Tyler Wigg Stevenson, who is he used to do anti-nuclear like protesting, and he was really involved in that. And he talks about how we're like called to live in the dividing lines. We're called to live in the division between the fact that like the world is so broken and that we have this hope. And like that's the space that as Christians we're called to occupy, and we're called to like be part of that with God, and having confidence in the fact that God can renew, and that God chooses to use us today to be part of bringing about that renewal. But it's really hard. I also don't buy the idea that like the dualistic kind of, we could have gone into this a little bit in Romans, but the kind of like dualistic, like, no, we are spirit, when I think when the new kingdom comes, it's going to be a restoration of this world, and that we will have physical bodies. And that also matters for the way that we treat the world now, and also the way that we respond to people as physical human beings, and how we seek their flourishing and fullness of spirit life, and how we love our neighbors really well like that, including in the way that we look after our planet, well, God's planet, that we've been given stewardship over.
Perhaps, I mean, I always get told off for speaking in sermons, but perhaps there is something that uniquely that Christians offer through the message of the cross, which is that resurrection is possible, change is possible, new life is possible, but it comes through the valley of despair, the valley of lament, and it comes, I think, the most important message that Christians can give, it comes through sacrifice. And that is the sticking point, isn't it? Because we can solve all these problems. We can solve the climate crisis. We can share out water supplies. We can help people in need, but somebody somewhere has to give up something they really like. Yeah. And that Christian message, that message which is fundamental to the Christian faith, is something that perhaps the Christian church can give and can share.
Yes, absolutely, like absolutely. And also it's something that like hopefully can be a motivating force for Christians, and like a challenge to Christians. I always feel like as Christians we should be at like the forefront of social justice movements, and so often we're not. Like there have been amazing instances where we are, and there are so many Christians who are really passionate and like have been working for years on social justice issues. But yeah, I think you're right in that there is a cost to following Jesus, and we're told that we're told that there's going to be sacrifice, there's going to be persecution, and I think you're right in that it is going to be costly. And I think that also, like, sometimes we can think, I think with climate, like there are definitely things that we probably should all be thinking about doing on a personal level, like that will cost us, maybe financially, maybe in terms of giving up some of like the things that we normally or have liked to eat and changing them for more eco-friendly alternatives, or changing our buying or spending habits. But there's also cost potentially in terms of time, like giving up time to go along to a protest, giving up time to write to your MP, giving up like maybe even like using your influence to challenge your workplace to do things differently, maybe thinking about like an ethical pension rather than having a pension, like challenging your workplace to try and get those kinds of things, which you're potentially risking difficult conversations, but yeah, doing those really proactive.
I would say the hardest thing from my experience with congregations and people is to sacrifice your idea, is to sacrifice what you perceive to be your beliefs. So I would say, in terms of the water crisis, sacrifice nationalism, sacrifice pride, sacrifice your politics, and say to political parties that you have perhaps supported your entire life, and your parents have supported, and your grandparents have supported, we will not support you unless you do something about the climate crisis. And we will, we will not buy your newspaper, if I were being very controversial, unless you start responding to our views. And I think sacrificing preconceptions and prejudices, against veganism, for example, a lot of, I think there's a real challenge there for us all. Well, I think, Sienna, we better bring to a close there. It's been fascinating talking to you. I think we've actually achieved our brief, and I think you have found hope in hopelessness. So well done, Sienna.
Well, thank you for doing this with me.
Oh no, and it's been great fun, and thank you so much. And we wish you well for all your work at present, working with students, and all the best for your campaigning and your volunteering. We just go out into the world now with our Bibles in one hand and our newspapers in the other, saying, what is the message that we as preachers and Christians can share with one another? How do we bring God's hope into the hopelessness that we see all around us? I've got too excited and I've lost my script, which says things like what we people have to do. Here it is. So if you enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on Twitter at @pulpit_politics or using the hashtag Politics in the Pulpit. We also have a Facebook group which you can access through the Joint Public Issue Team's Facebook page and the website jpit.uk. That's jpit.uk. Let's go now then into both our politics and our pulpits with a blessing, and a blessing this day for Passion Sunday. Christ crucified to draw you to himself, to find in him a sure ground for faith, a firm support for hope, and the assurance of sins forgiven. And the blessing of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with you now and evermore. Amen. Thank you so much for listening. I do hope you'll be with us next week. All the very best. God bless.